if you can imagine this, like 200 miles an hour, the car is wandering from one side of the road to the other. And these guys with their balls of steel are like, yeah, it's a little disturbing. Sometimes a race car comes along that upsets the apple cart, that changes the paradigm for racing. And this happens once in a generation. And probably one of the greatest cars that ever did that is the Porsche 917. Now, most people know the 917 from the movie Le Mans with Steve McQueen looking jaunty in his little Gulf-colored cars. And there's a whole lot more to the story than just that one movie. The car only had a 2.5-year racing career, and yet it's still remembered today, and it is worshipped today, decades later, because of what it accomplished in that short amount of time. You have to go back to the beginning to understand how special the 917 was in its origin. In 1967, after Le Mans, the FIA changed the rules, saying that it was time to put an end to the 7-liter GT40s that had come out. And they were going to restrict engine size coming up in the next couple of years. So prototypes were going to be 3 liters. Sports cars were going to be 5 liters. Now, the Ford-Ferrari wars that have been going on were about to end. Ford in 67 was like, we've done it, we made our point, we've spent millions of dollars to pull off this stunt. And they handed their whole GT40 program over to John Weir in England, sponsored by Gulf. And Porsche stepped in to now begin the Porsche-Ferrari wars. And they had already been moving their way up slowly through the ranks at Le Mans. They had never won a world championship. They had never won Le Mans. But they'd won so much. For such a small company, they had done a tremendous amount in racing. And they had built the 906, then the 910 and the 907, the 908 was now their front-running car. And it was a 3-liter. And it fit perfectly into that prototype level. But Porsche sat back and was like, what about this 5-liter sports car thing? There's a hole in the rules here we can exploit. And they waited almost a full year to make a decision about that. And they really thought about it. And then they're like, let's do it. This is our opportunity to win everything. This is the path to victory at Le Mans. And they started building what would be known as the 917. Now, the beginning of it was the engine. They wanted to build that 5-liter rule. And they never built an engine that big. They had flat 6s and they had flat 8s. And they made the decision to make a flat 12. Now, they'd never built this before. And it was June of 1968 where they gave them the green flag to start building this car. And they had to build it quick, from scratch, everything. They took 2 of their well-known and well-practiced 6-cylinders and put them together in the center. So, and I'll get a little geeky here because this is all tech stuff, but I love it. So, like, how do you get the power when you put the butt ends of an engine together? You could put a flywheel on one end of the crankshaft somewhere, but the crank is so long, you would just start getting vibrations in it, and it would just shake the engine apart. So what they decided was to take the power off the center of the crankshaft where that vibration would begin. There's a gear that goes up, and that powers the fan, the cooling fan for our 917, and runs some of the ancillaries. And then the other one goes down and powers the transmission. And because it's such a package, the clutch on a 917 is only 7 inches. They built the engine, it came out at 4.5 liters. The predictions were that hopefully it would make over 500 horsepower, which for Porsche at that time was a moonshot. It ended up making 550 horsepower in the 4.5 liter form. They were onto something. They're like, okay, we've got the heart of the car now. Now we need the car. Up to that point, Porsche had built space frame chassis out of aluminum, and this was a very old technology. This is stuff from the 50s, but it was something that they knew, and they were building quickly. The cars, race cars now were transitioning into what were called monocoque, and that was aluminum panels built in boxes, and they would create the structure of the car. Then you just bolted things on the end of the boxes. They were lighter, they were stronger, they were the new technology. But Porsche, at heart, was a conservative company. It was an interesting juxtaposition because Ferry Porsche was from the old school and Ferdinand Piëch was from the new school, and they would butt up against each other all the time. You know, Ferdinand's wanted to build the latest, fastest stuff, and they kept each other in check. So they were like, we know this space frame. So they built it out of aluminum. They built the chassis out of different size tubes depending on where there was load on it. So some of them were thicker, some of them were thinner, but they built the entire chassis as one air chamber. So they would drill into the tube, weld a tube on, then drill into the tube, and so the whole thing was one chamber. The reason for that was so that you could pressurize the frame, and if pressure was lost, you had a crack. In an aluminum frame, that was quite possible. The stories come that like they pressurized it with nitrogen and it made it lighter, and they put helium in there and all kinds of crazy. It's simple. It's just engineering. They just pressurized it. The mechanics would check it. It was a little Schrader valve on either side, and you just put your thing on there and like, oh, this got pressure. It's not cracked. It was that simple. There was nothing mysterious about it. The other thing about the frame was that it had, and this is what they did with earlier cars, they would channel oil through the chassis. And the early 917s had a chamber that would move it through. Unfortunately, all that hot oil would turn the pedals and everything into a furnace and almost burn the drivers. But it was efficient, right? Their goal and Piëch's idea of a race car was not about the driver. This is way before driver safety and anybody gave a bit about the driver. The car was supposed to be as low drag as possible. They took it to a wind tunnel and they made a body for this amazing chassis. The chassis, when it was complete, 105, 104 pounds. You can just pick it up. I've picked up a 917 chassis. It's pretty cool. They made a fiberglass body for it that was bonded to the aluminum that made it even stronger. And the car, as we know, it was beautiful. But most people think of the Golf car from the 70s. The original car in 1969, what they finished, it looked a lot more like the 908 Longtails. Again, it was about minimum drag. And anything that they wanted to add to it, knack a duct or add a hole in it to bring fresh air to the driver, verboten. They wanted to keep it as smooth and fast as possible. What they ended up building was an undrivable car. They had built a car that is now moving into a realm that nobody had been before aerodynamically. So the top speed of a 908 Longtail at that time was like 185 miles an hour. And later on, the 908s would move up towards 200 miles an hour. The 917 was capable out of the box of over 220 miles an hour. And you got to remember that as you go up in speed, air becomes exponentially more dense and changes the way it moves over a car. They finish the car and they finish it. And this is amazing. And this was the time of going to the moon, right? We were building a machine that could get us on the moon. That kind of mentality was global. From the day they said, we're going to build a 917 to the day they had one, they had 25 of them lined up, was 10 months. 10 months to build a functional race car from scratch. And they were 2 days early, in fact, their goal. There was obviously some issues. It's a fresh race car. It came out, I believe it was March 1969 when it showed up at the Geneva Auto Show, when they first showed the first finished version of it. And people freaked out. It was like, what the heck is that? You might as well have brought a UFO. So the world saw this spaceship of a car. Ferrari saw something completely different. They saw a huge threat. And they didn't have a Group 5 sports car. So luckily, Ferrari had just sold their road-going division to Fiat, and they had the money to build a sports car. Now, what's a sports car? So a prototype is something that you build special. It's a special car. It can be one of one. A sports car, at that point, they were asking for 50 examples to be made. That would be lowered down to 25 eventually. But a sports car had to have a few things, a few elements to it. And these looked like prototypes. They were technically supposed to be road-going vehicles. So the 917 has a turnkey ignition. And if you see the key, they even drilled little holes in it to make it lighter. It's supposed to have a passenger seat because it's a two-seater. So they put a little vestibule, little seat in there next to the guy. It had to have a spare tire. So Porsche got together with, I believe, B.F. Goodrich to make one of the first Space Saver spares to slip into the back of the thing. My favorite part, it had to have room for luggage. So in the back of it, if you see the 917 tail up, there's 2 fiberglass trays in there. And that technically was put in for luggage capacity. It's not the tray where the mechanics put their tools, although it became that. That's where the luggage goes. It had to have taillights and turn signals and all kinds of things. So they did all of that. We basically dressed the prototype up with sports car trappings. And a few people in the future did actually make their 917s road going after they were sold as old race cars. Ferrari's caught with their pants down, and they start the creation of the 512. Porsche is months ahead. Porsche says, okay, it's time to get the cars going. Up to that point, homologation included building a certain amount of cars. And if you could prove that you had 18 cars being built or 7 cars of parts, they go, okay, you got the trappings of 25 cars. The FIA was like, we want to see 25 cars lined up on this date. And Porsche pulled it off. And the photograph, this is another weird myth. You'll see the photograph, and it's 25 917s all lined up. And you see like the FIA inspectors kind of going, and the weird rumors were like, oh, they were just, bodies sitting on truck chassis and they cheated and all this. They built the cars. And you talk to the mechanics. They busted their ass. They actually finished 2 days before the FIA showed up. They did admit that one of them, the suspension pieces weren't correct. They just needed it on its wheels. But other than that, they put gas in all the cars and they're like, which one would you like to drive? So they just called the bluff and they pulled it off. So you got the car, it's homologated, let's go racing. That's a whole other story because the car did not drive well. They had put it in the wind tunnel in a miniature form, and they had done all the math in the world, but their goal was to build a low drag car that was going to win Le Mans. They had made other plans for the shorter tracks. In fact, most people don't know this. The original 917 had 2 tails that were available. It had a longer tail and a shorter tail. They thought about it. They were like, longer tail will be for the long circuits and the shorter tail for the shorter circuits, and had different wings on the back. But most of us have seen the weird, crazy, shark-like long tail early 917s. And it was awful. People called it a widowmaker. There were stories of it going down, like testing it down the Mulsanne Straight, that the car would need the entire width of the Mulsanne Straight because it would just wander from one. If you can imagine this, like 200 miles an hour, the car is wandering from one side of the road to the other. And these guys with their balls of steel are like, yeah, it's a little disturbing. Like if you really disturb one of these guys, there is something insanely wrong with the car. And the Porsche drivers didn't want to drive it. And that's another one of the weird myths. They're like, well, they didn't want to drive it because it was a terrifying car. No, a race car driver wants to drive the best car for the race. And for most of those races at the time, the 908 was the best car. That car had reached its peak of development. It had gone through its growing stage. The 908 was a great car in 1969. And they would end up winning the first time the world championship with the 908. So the Porsche drivers drove that. They were trying to convince people and find drivers. If you come on out and, they called up Brian Redman, who wasn't a Porsche driver at the time, like, would you come out and drive one of the 917s for us? And Joe Sifford, and like, would you maybe, could you possibly come out and test this for us? And it brought a lot of new drivers into the fold. The joke is that they couldn't find Porsche drivers, so they asked BMW drivers to do it. And they got people to come out and test them and drive them. They started racing them, and it went through its growing stages, but it wasn't a stable car. And now all of that, the rear end would kind of lift at speed. It would wander under braking. With that car's already unstable, and braking made it even worse. And the 917, they had developed some amazing brakes for it. It could outbrake the chassis. Like all the drivers talked about, like they couldn't use all the brakes because it would get unstable under braking. So it was an amazing package. It just didn't work. This should have been the greatest car ever. And it seemed to be like an abject failure. But it had potential, and they had invested so much in it. At this time, in 1968, John Ware won Le Mans again with a small engine GT40. And in 1969, he'd do it again. And Porsche's 908s were lined up to win Le Mans that year, and he still did it. So John Ware and his team were the team. At Sebring in 1969, they approached John Ware and said, we're thinking about having you run the Porsche team for 1970. And this is a really strange move when you think about it. There's a German company asking a British team with an American sponsor to run their car. And not everybody at Porsche was comfortable with this. But he could take these old cars and make them win. And he only had a couple of cars. He didn't have fleets of GT40s. He made the cars he had work and run and win. An excellent choice. And of course, he had seen the car at Geneva, and he was like, that's the future. Yes. So they finally came to an agreement. And John Ware gets his first chance to test the cars in late 1969. Now, this is only months before the first time it shows up at a race in the 1970 season at Daytona. And it wins. This is its first win at the last race of the year in Austria. It wins. And I mean, by the skin of its teeth, it wins. And even the drivers were like, I don't even know how we did that. They pulled it off. So they had all the data from that track, from that last run. So very smartly, they stayed there with a couple of 917s, and they brought in the 917 PA, which was a car they built for Can-Am in the United States. And it was a kind of open top car. It looked more like a 908 Spider. And I think that's actually part of the body that they started using on it. But it was a 917 underneath. And the drivers liked driving that. So they drove it around the track, and they said, okay, what's good about this? They said, and this is the Porsche team along next to John Ware, kind of the handing off of what was going on. Now, what happened at that track over those few days is what made the 917 we remember it. They were driving it, wasn't stable, they couldn't figure it out. They thought there was chassis flex. Everybody was guessing. They kept messing with the suspension. They're like, the chassis is doing something. And they're like, but the Can-Am car is fine. Like, what's the deal? There's a thing called observational engineering. It doesn't really exist today with computers and everything, but you can sit there and engineer something by looking at it and breaking it down in your head. And John Horseman, who is Ware's right-hand man, the story goes is that the car came in, and it was later in the day, and there were bugs. Obviously, we all have driven through bugs with our cars and smashes on the windshield, and it's inevitable, especially at those speeds. And there were gnats all over the front of the car. And as you went farther back, there were less gnats until there were none. And at the top of the rear spoiler, there were just a couple of gnats. So the conclusion was there wasn't any air hitting the back of the car. That it was just blowing off the car and had no downforce at the rear. And Porsche was already after this. Porsche were the ones who kind of were like, they knew something was wrong. They brought, and this is so 24 Hours of Lemons, I love it. They brought sheets of aluminum, duct tape, and self-tapping screws. And they were going to figure out what was wrong. And right there, they're like, we got to do something about this rear end. We got to raise the rear end and get into the airflow, which was very similar to the Can-Am version of it. So they cut the rear end of this car off. Now, the 917 at that point had all these crazy flappy wings all over it to try to keep it stable. They're really cool, actually. The wings on the front and there's wings on the back, and they're connected to the suspension. So when the suspension lifts, the wings are supposed to get up and push the car back down, and they go back to zero drag. So they just hack all this stuff off. I mean, you can imagine them as Sawzall. They were literally taking the sheets of aluminum on the Armco barrier and shaping them out there at the racetrack. They build this hideous-looking wedge and stick it on the back of the car. And they send out Brian Redman, and they're like, go drive the car. And he goes around, and he comes in. He's 3 seconds a lap faster. And he's like, this is a race car. Like, that moment, that Baji transformation, right? No, just hammering stuff out of aluminum. The car was 3 seconds lap faster. A couple more adjustments, 4 seconds a lap faster. When they were done, it was 5 seconds a lap faster. You would have had to put another 50, 60 horsepower in the engine to accomplish that, just out of changing the body style. So what was born out of that was what's called the 917K, or Kurtzek, short tail. And the short tail is the car that most of us know. It's the Gulf car that we see. They bring the car to Daytona, and Daytona is the opening race. This is what's going to prove that everything's worked out, that this weird relationship between a British and American and Germans and the car and the change is all going to work. So they rent Daytona, and they banish all the Daytona employees. They don't want anybody to see what they're doing. And they run Daytona. They run like 26 hours in there to get the car ready. And they discover one of the problems with Daytona is that when you're in the banking, it's just 31 degrees, you're looking into the banking as you're going around it. They couldn't see out of it. So Daytona cars have another window above the main front window. And that was for you looking out and being able to see in front of you. And they made a few other developments because Daytona is a very different type of race. It destroys suspensions. It's really rough. And they got the car ready. It shows up at Daytona, and there's 2 of them. What had happened in the meantime is, remember I said that Porsche wasn't completely, some of the Porsche family wasn't completely into this whole British team thing. They created another team called Porsche Salzburg, or Porsche Austria, which was supposed to be a privateer team owned by the Peach family. And there's another 917 on the grid, the 2 Gulf Ware cars and Porsche Salzburg. And they're like, oh, okay. All right, we'll see how that works out. And 1970 Daytona was the beginning of what would be 2 years of utter domination. They would come in first and second at Daytona, setting records as they went. They would win Le Mans for the first time. And they had started developing another long-tail version higher up called the Langheck, the long-tail. So the long-tail, that was going to be the car that was going to win. And it was actually a Salzburg car, won Le Mans that year. Then they win next year. They do Daytona again. They do Sebring, and they do Le Mans. And the rules change. That the 917 is no longer a viable sports car. They knew that, which I thought was interesting. They knew that in 1968. They knew going in that this car would only last 3 years. And yet they did it anyway. And it became an unbeatable icon with some of the greatest liveries of all time. The hippie livery, the Gulf, the Salzburg liveries, just stunning cars. But they didn't stop there. Just so you know, the 917 lived on for a few more years when it went to Can-Am in the United States and ended up ruling there as well. The 917 was and is the unstoppable race car.
Premier Financial Services makes it easier and more affordable than you could possibly imagine to own your dream car. Their Simple Lease is one of the most powerful tools in the world of exotic car financing. You get all the benefits like the tax savings and the low payments of a lease with all the additional benefits that you normally find in a traditional finance arrangement. You can build up equity, you can pay it off early, you can trade in and out of cars because you get a very clear and easy to understand amortization table to understand what your payoff will be any month throughout your term. And all the while, the amazing team from Premier Financial Services will be right there to help you along the way. They've been supporters of the VINwiki channel now for 5 years in a row, so we can't thank them enough for that, but mostly we're thankful for the fact that they can help you make it easier than ever to own your dream car. Check them out now.